Well, thanks, Mark, for having me again. But it seems that we are in a relatively advanced stage. I mean, considering the participants in the rounds of negotiations that are taking place in Doha, already the White House special envoy to the Middle East, Brett McGurk, is already in Doha. And as we've heard from President-elect Trump the day before yesterday, he's been sending his own Middle East envoy, newly appointed Middle East envoy Steve Witkoff, also to Doha. Implying that there is something that's being intensively negotiated between the parties involved, namely Israel and Hamas, in hope to reach some kind of deal, probably a partial deal, before President Trump gets into office by January 20. But as we continue to hear, I mean, on one hand, that there is progress, that there is a possibility for a deal. We hear equally similar statements on gaps that remain between the two sides, nearly concerning all the main topics that are of concern to both sides, whether in relation to Hamas' key demand that any agreement should include a clear statement that this is a path towards ending the war in Gaza and the full Israeli withdrawal from occupied Gaza Strip, as compared to Netanyahu and his right-wing government, who only want to speak about cessation of hostilities. Because, again, Netanyahu's position since the beginning of the war nearly 16 months ago, that Hamas has to be totally defeated, not just militarily, but also not to continue being a governing force in Gaza, but at the same time, without actually specifying an alternative. If Netanyahu doesn't want Hamas, he also doesn't want the Palestinian Authority. So it's not clear who exactly is going to be responsible for running Gaza after a ceasefire is reached. Many other issues that remain to be negotiated concerning the number of Palestinian prisoners to be released in return for each Israeli hostage, and the fate of those Palestinian prisoners, especially those ones who've received heavy sentences, meaning several life sentences, and whether they're going to stay in Gaza or whether they're going to be deported, the future of Israeli presence along the border between Egypt and Gaza, known as the Philadelphia Corridor, whether Israel is going to totally pull out or partially pull out. And the same applies to the so-called Netzarim corridor in the middle of Gaza, which Israel has built months after the war, dividing Gaza into two parts. Again, whether Israel is going to fully withdraw from that Netzarim corridor, and as well the issue of the return of Palestinian displaced from their homes in northern Gaza, whether they're going to be allowed back to their homes, and who exactly is going to be allowed, whether it's only going to be women and children or accompanied by men as well. Israel insists on some sort of mechanism to search the Palestinians that are wanting to return to their homes in the north. So there are many complicated issues, and each one of those issues are good enough to make those negotiations a failure. But at the same time, probably the only factor that is giving relatively positive hope for these negotiations are the statements that are being made by Trump himself, that something has to be reached before he gets into office, before January 20, while, of course, as we expect from the U.S. administration, whether Biden administration or the incoming Trump administration, usually the blame is always put on Hamas and not the Israeli side, which is actually the one that's been leading this war of genocide and aggression against the Palestinians over the past 16 months, resulting in the death of 4,600 people. So, I mean, it's 46,000 people, I'm sorry. So, I mean, again, it's a kind of a difficult situation, but it seems that everybody's exerting tremendous effort, whether Egypt, Qatar, or the Americans themselves. And of course, maybe one sign that all the parties concerned are looking forward to is whether the head of the Israeli intelligence, the Mossad, is going to head himself, David Barnea, is going to head to Doha himself, along with the head of the Egyptian intelligence, because that would mean that something is really, really close. So we have a few days to come before Trump gets into office. He's threatened that all hell will break loose if no deal is reached, not just for Hamas, but for everybody else. There was a significant development, Mark, about Trump reposting a TV interview with well-known economist, Mr. Sachs, in which he sharply criticized Netanyahu, implying that the criticism is not only going to be towards Hamas, but also, of course, towards Netanyahu and his government, who actually bore most of the blame.
Well, it's about time, I guess, that we had some negative comments coming out of the United States against Israel. So progress is being made in the talks. You mentioned many of the key sticking points there when you were talking, Khaled Dawoud. What do you think the main one is? What do you think the main problem is going to be?
I'm sorry, Mark, can you repeat that again?
Yes, of course. What do you, of all the things that you mentioned there and the problems that need to be overcome in these talks, what do you think the main sticking point is going to be?
I think each one of them, to be honest with you, Mark, is a major sticking point. But again, how Hamas demand for a total end to the war, whether this plan that's going to be announced will include that such a path, or as the Israelis insist, only a temporary partial deal is what we should be looking forward to. Again, the assumption is that if a partial deal is reached, at least that's the assumption the Americans, the Qataris, the Egyptians are working on. If a partial deal is reached, maybe this would be an encouraging step. If we see Israeli hostages being released, if we see Palestinian hostages being released, maybe that will help both parties to proceed towards a more permanent ceasefire. But again, I think that the Israelis will never fall short of putting obstacles that will always allow them to claim that Hamas has violated the agreement and that they would want to go back to the use of force again. Of course, also to be very helpful if the Palestinians manage to agree amongst themselves on a future government for Gaza, whether it's a kind of a committee made up of technocrats or something that assures that the Palestinian Authority remains to be the main party to negotiate with for the future, in support with other key Arab countries such as Egypt and the United Arab Emirates. But as I mentioned, I mean, each point is a very thorny issue, whether the numbers to be released, whether the withdrawal from Philadelphia corridor, Netzarim corridor, the return of the people, Palestinian people to the north. These are all very difficult issues, and it's not clear yet where we stand on those issues.
And what role, if any, do you think public opinion is playing in all this, especially within Israel? Is that playing a role when it comes to putting pressure on Netanyahu to get a deal, or does Netanyahu and his far-right coalition care at all about public opinion?
They definitely care about the public opinion. The demonstrations have been gaining steam again, and especially after the videos that are being released by Hamas of the woman soldier almost a week ago, complaining of her prison conditions, spending more than 460 days in a tunnel, not knowing what her fate is. Again, only the day before yesterday, the announcement that the bodies of two Israelis were found in a tunnel, a father and his son. This all adds to the pressure on the Netanyahu government. But of course, everybody knows, including the leaders of the Israeli opposition, whether Yair Lapid or Benny Gantz, who was once member of the Israeli government, they know that Netanyahu always gives priority to staying in office. And many of his right-wing hardline coalition members who are basically terrorists. I mean, by U.S. standards, they are members of terrorist organizations such as Ben Gvir and Smotrich. They know that if they reach a deal that might result in the ouster of Mr. Netanyahu, they won't be able to get back into office again. So that's another key problem that's facing Israel internally. But certainly there is a lot of pressure from the families of hostages, the demonstrations that are taking place every weekend, an increasing number, and the contacts that they are conducting with not just the Biden administration that is leaving basically in 10 days, but equally with Mr. Trump, who is now practically leading the negotiations in an effort to reach some sort of a deal before January 20, when he gets back into the White House.